Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. And today we're finally going to get to the end of Reconstruction and this horrible, tension filled period after the Civil War. And today we're going to talk about the impact of Reconstruction. Learning targets today are to talk about why it ended, reasons why it ended, talk about its successes, its failures, talk about the experience of African Americans in the South, and then this new segregated society that emerges and how blacks feel about it. So Reconstruction ends because the support for Reconstruction kind of declines because there's other things to worry about. It's just kind of this nagging problem that we have going on. We have to talk about fixing the corrupt politics that are starting to emerge in the cities and even in Grant's administration. We need to fix the economy, and the military occupation of the South is soaring. The cost of it is soaring, and we can't just continue to do it forever. And then finally, in 1872 as well, the Freedmen's Bureau is dissolved for African Americans. And I mentioned before President Grant, he's a Civil War hero. He was the general. Corruption plagues not necessarily him, but his administration, but it leads back to him. And his party, the Republicans, begins to break into factions and splinter because they want different things. So, in summary, there's no support for this president, and he cannot pursue his Reconstruction policies. So, basically, it starts to dwindle at this point. And the court cases also go to town on Reconstruction, kind of the rights that were given to African Americans. The court starts to basically take these away. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was passed by Congress, and this guarantees blacks the use of public facilities. But later, it's deemed unconstitutional, and we'll talk about that later. But the Supreme Court basically says that the local governments, as in state and city and local governments, should make these decisions, not federal, national governments. But the main part of this is the slaughterhouse cases. Basically about a Louisiana slaughterhouse claiming that a monopoly was had and they weren't being treated equally under the 14th Amendment. But basically, that doesn't matter. What you need to know about the slaughterhouse cases is that the federal government, the court says the federal government has no control over how a state chooses to interpret these rights for its citizens. So I'm sitting here saying that blacks have this right, this right, this right, and this right, but they're all very vague. And I shouldn't be able to say how the states interpret that. So this very much weakens the protections made or given to blacks under the 14th Amendment. And from this point on, Southern states feel more free to discriminate against blacks. And another case, U.S. versus Cruikshank, basically the court says that the due process and equal protection clauses under the 14th Amendment, we've talked about it in class, but it does a lot of things, only protects citizens from the state and not from other citizens. So all these court cases together lay the foundation for Southern states to go ahead and further restrict minority rights in the future. And while this is happening, a group of whites called the Redeemers have the goal of coming together and returning political power in the South to white Southern Democrats, or basically these white racists. They want power again in the South. And so the strategy is to ostracize or basically not associate with radical Republicans in Congress, basically pit them against one another, or basically say that they are old, outdated, we shouldn't be pursuing their policies anymore. Discredit African American politicians as being incompetent, not good at their jobs, corrupt, wasteful, and then find common issues that would unite white Southerners against everyone else. So these Redeemers are both Democrats and Republicans, and the result is that they start getting these wealthy Southern landowners as governors of states. They begin to send former Confederate leaders to Congress, and these white Southerners unite behind this new Democratic Party, and eventually whites regain political power in the South. And the event that actually ends Reconstruction officially is the 1876 presidential election. What happens is it's one of those disputes, that happened in 1824, 1876, 2000. It's Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, versus Samuel Tilden, the Democrat. Tilden wins the southern states and 51% of the popular vote, but he does not have enough of the electoral college to be elected president. So what happens? A whole committee's made. The Southerners have control of this, the Republicans have control of that. But basically, this, in summary, Hayes is allowed to be elected president, and he is given the disputed electoral votes in the South. And in return, all remaining federal troops would be pulled from the South. So as soon as Hayes becomes president, we remove the federal troops, and now federal Reconstruction is over, and it's all up to whatever the states want to do now. And that could be a dangerous thing for these African Americans. So what were the results, the successes and failures of Reconstruction? The South gets a new infrastructure, a lot of northern businesses, in addition to the scallywags and the carpetbaggers, come down to support their new school system. The new railroads are added in the South. New ports for ships are added in the South. We also diversify our crops, because if we put all of our eggs into one basket and put all of our cotton into that basket, and we have a bad cotton crop, then it's down the drain. It's lost. But now if we have more diversified crops like oranges, peaches, tobacco, which we start producing more of, lumber, we can produce lumber, and other industry takes over in the South. We have a more diversified economy, which will make it stronger. For African Americans, their successes, they begin to purchase their own farms after Reconstruction. They start to have choices in jobs. Before, they had no choice but to be a farmer, or to work in agriculture. Mostly it was in slavery. They start to receive basic educations. Black colleges start to pop up all over the South in order to educate these African Americans. And the Civil War amendments also are big victories for the African Americans. The 13th saying slavery is prohibited, the 14th giving equality and citizenship to former slaves, and the 15th giving the right to vote to males, African Americans. Women, on the other hand, notice I said males, they do not get the right to vote, and this movement splinters because some feel that they were left out. They should have been given the right to vote. The people who did not, however, said that if we try to pass the 15th Amendment with suffrage for all, it would not get passed by the states. And so that was the American Women's Suffrage Association, or the AWSA. They feel that it wouldn't have been passed if it did include suffrage for women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the lady from the Seneca Falls Convention and the starter of the women's rights movement, she feels that women should receive suffrage immediately, and she helps begin the National Women's Suffrage Association, more important organization out of these two. And Wyoming, thanks to their petitioning, successfully becomes the first territory to allow women to vote, and then more of the western states will take over from there. More party affiliations. The entire political landscape changes. Republicans, because they were born out of anti-slavery, are now known as the party that freed the slaves, which means that they're supported by blacks everywhere. And they're also supported by people in the North who are businessmen. They become known as the party of big business, and that even includes all the way up until today. Republicans are the party of big business and businessmen. The Democrats, on the other hand, are dominating the white South. So if the whites are in control in the South, then they're usually voting Democrat. They're backed by more of the industrial worker more than the businessman, but they're both supported by the industrial worker and Southern farmers. So you have to strike a balance between satisfying those two very different groups of farmers and workers, or factory workers. And then finally, this is one of those turning points where we have a tipping of federal versus state power. the federal government asserts its authority over the states during Reconstruction. And remember, it's supposed to be a balance, but certain points in history, like the Civil War, the nullification crisis coming up, the New Deal and the Great Depression, will all tip it toward the federal side, and the federal government will gain more power to the point where presently a lot of people think that the federal government has too much power. But the people, at the expense of the Southerners, decide on a balance of power between state and federal here. And basically, they don't give as much power to the federal government. And they say it's better to let the South decide its own problems than let it remain under federal military control. So what happens to African Americans post-Reconstruction? Well, with the federal government out of the way, a lot of states begin to pass Jim Crow laws, or laws that segregate blacks and whites, and that means separate. This means we have separate train cars, waiting rooms, separate Bibles to use for blacks and whites, jury boxes, restaurants, cemeteries. Even after they die, they don't want to be buried next to a black person. So these Jim Crow laws segregate society. And it comes to a head in Plessy versus Ferguson, the train car case in 1896, where the Supreme Court finally says that this needs to be made on a local level. If the separate but equal facilities is what the South wants, then that is what they should have. These decisions are these facilities are separate but equal in theory, but in reality, a lot of times they weren't. A lot of times in segregated schools, the state would spend a lot more money on white students than they would on black students, let's say. And then we've already discussed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which is deemed unconstitutional in the civil rights cases. And again, it says that public accommodation is a local issue. So how do we get around the 15th Amendment if we're the South? So we can't really just nullify the 15th Amendment, but we can put restrictions on it. So those restrictions are the poll tax, which is a fee for voting, and most African Americans are too poor to afford that. Literacy tests, which most of these blacks are still illiterate, so they cannot pass the test. And then grandfather clauses. We'll let you vote just as long as your ancestors could vote prior to 1866, and black ancestors were slaves during that time, so they're not allowed to vote. Plus, all white primaries means that the whites get to pick the candidates who run in the general election in November, which blacks basically won't have a candidate to vote for at that point. So the result of all of these things is that African American voter participation falls drastically to the point where a lot of African Americans don't even try to vote or have any political say in the South. And how do we respond to this? Well, African Americans differ on how they think we should respond. Basically, it's Booker T. Washington versus W.E.B. Du Bois, or Webb Du Bois. Booker T's view is that we should accommodate blacks, or blacks should accommodate themselves to white segregation. Segregation isn't going away. They're not going to just like us overnight. So we need to focus on building our economic resources and reputations as hardworking individuals and good members of society. And he starts something called the Tuskegee Institute in Georgia, so blacks can earn a vocational education. And that means it's kind of like Anthis Career Center. You go and learn a trade rather than going and learning academics. They can then apply it right away and start earning a living for themselves. Well, Webb Du Bois is just the opposite. He gets a doctorate from Harvard, the first African American to do so, and he is openly critical of Washington's view to accommodate to segregation. And his view is that it's not something that needs to be earned. It should be full and immediate equality. And then Ida B. Wells, she's not really in this argument, but she is a famous journalist who campaigns for the proper treatment of blacks, and she is against lynching, which is when a mob breaks into a house, grabs a black, and hangs them from the nearest tree. And it's a horrible thing that's going on in the South, and they usually get off scot-free for it, since it was a black person that was lynched. And that brings us to the end of the effects of the end of Reconstruction. So go ahead and fill out those learning targets, circle any questions, bring them to class. We'll talk them over, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.